This is chapter 3, Water and Life. So in the last chapter, we talked about the different types of chemical bonds and how water molecule is composed of a polar covalent bond between an oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms. So we get H2O. But it's polar in that there is an unequal distribution in the sharing of these electrons. So the oxygen atom is larger and more electronegative, so it's going to have a greater pull on those electrons. So the electrons are going to spend more time near the oxygen end of the molecule. Right? So we have this polarity develop. So we have a slightly negative end where the negative electrons spend more time, and a slightly positive end near the hydrogens where the electrons spend less of their time. Right? So we have this unequal, uneven distribution of the charges. So this polarity or this polar nature of the water molecule is what allows water to form hydrogen bonds with each other. Right? So we talked about hydrogen bonds being not true bonds in the sense of the word because there's no real electrons involved in these type of bonds. They're more so kind of weak attractive forces. So we have the slightly positive hydrogen end would be attracted to the negative oxygen end of another water molecule. So these chemical bonding patterns, or the polar nature of water molecule, is going to lead to 4 unique emergent properties of water that make it so vital for life. So this is one reason why when scientists look for life on other planets or signs of life on other planets, one of the first things that we're going to look for is water. So some of these unique emergent properties of water that help to facilitate an environment to support life are cohesive behavior. So this is that hydrogen bonding activity, right? So water molecules tend to stick together, right? Can form the surface tension. Water has an ability to moderate temperature. So it has what we'll look at called a high heat capacity, high heat evaporization. Water is also known as the universal solvent, so it's very adept at dissolving different substances and facilitating a lot of our biochemical reactions in the cell. And finally, water forms a unique type of solid. So normally, when a liquid transitions into the solid state, it becomes more dense, more heavy, or compacted. But water forms a unique solid in that it becomes less dense as ice, and it actually structurally kind of expands upon freezing instead of condensing. So we'll look at how this plays an important role in facilitating life as well. So the cohesion of water molecules is basically that hydrogen bonding activity. Right? So hydrogen bonds that hold water molecules together is called cohesion. Right? So basically the tendency for these water molecules to want to stick together. Right? So cohesion results in a high surface tension. They're basically keeping that solid surface of the liquid water. Right? So this is showing the surface tension of the water just before the swimmer breaks through the surface. Those water molecules are still kind of trying to stick together and maintain that surface tension. It's also what allows some insects and the Jesus lizard, also known as the basilisk, to run or walk on the surface of the water. But we know the surface tension, the hydrogen bonds, we said were weak bonds. So it's not going to take a whole lot of force to break through the surface of the water, to break through this cohesion. The cohesion of water molecules is important when we look at transport of water and nutrients in plants. Right? So how plants are able to transport water and their nutrients all the way from the base, the roots of the plant system, to the very tip top of the plant, very tall trees and the leaves. So plants use cohesion and adhesion. So cohesion, we said, was where the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules help them to stick together, hold them together. Adhesion is where the water molecules are going to be attracted to a different substance or a surface. Right? So example would be the water and the plant cell walls. So this helps the water to kind of overcome the power of gravity and make its way up the tree. So this figure is showing the different colored dyed water, right, is making its way up to the top of this celery stalk. So it's using adhesion, back one, right, on kind of the walls of the plant cells, right, and then cohesion for the individual water molecules that are going to travel up the plant tissue together. So on Blackboard in the supplemental videos folder, there is a little animation that I posted that kind of shows this mechanism in action. Another unique emergent property of water that makes it vital for life is its ability to moderate temperatures. So water is able to absorb large amounts of heat without really undergoing a major temperature change. It can also release stored heat to cooler air. So this is called the specific heat. So specific heat of the substance is the amount of heat that must be absorbed or lost just for 1 gram of that substance to change its temperature by 1 degree Celsius. So this is why it takes water seemingly such a long time to reach a boiling point and boil. It takes even longer if you stand there and watch it. But because the water has a high specific heat, so it can absorb or carry a lot of heat energy without its actual temperature rising a whole lot. So this is important in things like with large bodies of water that can absorb and store large amounts of heat from the sun in the daytime and in the summer while only warming up a few degrees. It also helps to moderate the air and surface temperatures in these coastal areas. So more inland, you'll have higher temperatures on the surface, but near the coast, right, the coastline, they get that cool ocean breeze to help moderate the temperatures in these coastal areas. So land and soil has a much lower specific heat than water. So the land temperature, the temperature on the surface, would be much hotter than the temperature in the water. Another important emergent property of water is evaporative cooling, having to do with its moderation of temperature. So we said water has a high specific heat, right? So it also has a high heat of vaporization. So it means that it can absorb large amounts of heat before it evaporates, right, to convert it to a gas. And we know evaporation or vaporization is just when we transform a substance from the liquid state to the gaseous state. So water molecules that have a greater kinetic energy, right, since they've absorbed more heat energy, will be more excitable, right, be moving around more and leave the liquid state as the gas, right, or evaporate. And in the process, it carries some of that stored heat away with it, right, and makes the liquid water a bit cooler. Right? So this is evaporative cooling. So as the liquid evaporates, the remaining surface cools. So this helps to stabilize temperatures in organisms and in bodies of water. So this is the basic principle behind sweating, right? So how sweat works to cool us off. So you have to let the sweat evaporate from the surface of your skin in order to cool your body off. So if you just wipe the sweat away, it's not going to be able to work in this evaporative cooling. So it has to stay on your skin surface long enough to evaporate and carry that heat energy away with it. We said that water forms a unique solid in ice. So typically when a substance, a liquid, becomes a solid, it condenses down, becomes more dense and compacted. But water is unique in that it actually becomes less dense as a solid than as a liquid. At the freezing point, the water molecules form this crystalline lattice structure. So we end up with more kind of open airspace between some of the water molecules. Principle behind those hydrogen bonds that are going to keep the molecules far enough apart to make the ice about 10% less dense than liquid water, where all the water molecules are just kind of on top of each other. So this is important because ice floats, right, on the surface of the water. Floating ice is going to help to insulate the water below to help sustain life. So if ice became more dense and sank, then our bodies of water would freeze solid completely through and through, and it would make life impossible on Earth. So nothing would be able to survive in the solid ice. However, we are losing a lot of our planet's ice at an alarming rate. So many scientists are worried that climate change, global warming, is having a profound effect on our icy environments and habitats around the globe. So this is showing what the polar ice cap looked like in the 1980s versus just a few years ago, how much it has retreated and melted. So showing kind of the outline of where the ice sheet once was, right? And now how much it has receded. So we're opening up this ocean pathway between here. So this change in the habitat and the rate at which our glaciers and Arctic sea ice are disappearing can pose extreme challenges to certain species that depend on those icy habitats for their survival. So things like polar bears. However, there are some species that may be benefiting from this loss of ice, like the whale. So now they have a larger passage in the ocean to migrate to and from. But overall, as this ice melts, right, it's going to melt into water and add water volume to the oceans and contribute to rise of global sea levels. And then finally, we said another unique property of water is that is the universal solvent, or the solvent of life. So when we talk about a solution, we're just talking about a liquid that is a completely homogeneous, meaning a completely dissolved mixture of substance. So within a solution, you have two components. The solvent is what's doing the dissolving in the solution, and the solutes are what's being dissolved. So typically we talk about aqueous solutions, so where water is our solvent doing the dissolving. So this is an example of a salt water solution. Right? So we have water molecules as the solvent, and then the sodium chloride molecules are our solutes that are being dissolved by the water. So this property of water is very important in helping facilitate our biochemical reactions in the cell and in the body. So this universal solvent property, emergent property, goes back to its molecular structure, right, and its polarity. So those polar covalent bonds, right. So the slightly negative end of the oxygen atom and the slightly positive end of the hydrogen atom. So whenever you have an ionic compound like a salt, so in this example, sodium chloride, just table salt, and you dissolve it in water, each ion or component of that compound is going to be separated and surrounded by water molecules in what's called a hydration shell. So remember, with ionic bonds, you have a positively charged component, the cation, right, so our sodium, and a negatively charged component, the anion. Okay? So the negative end of the water molecule will surround and be attracted to the positive cation. The positive end of the water molecule will surround and be attracted to the negative anion. Right? So we end up separating and dissolving this compound, right? Separating these individual components. And thus we have dissolved the sodium chloride crystal, right? So when something is dissolved, right, in a solution, homogeneous just means that it's completely dissolved. So you can't really see the different components. It looks just like a clear water solution. So if you're looking at a glass of salt water or a glass of mineral water or a glass of distilled water, just looking at them on the surface, you couldn't tell what exactly is in that water because it's been dissolved as a homogeneous solution. We said a homogeneous solution is something that's completely dissolved. So the opposite would be a heterogeneous solution. So this would be something that does not dissolve in water or in a solution. So you're able to discern the individual components or different components in that mixture. So example, oil and water. So you can see the oil droplets, right, that are not dissolved. They're still visible in this mixture. So when we look at hydrophilic substances, these are substances that have a strong affinity for water, right? So they're hydrophilic, meaning they're water loving. So they don't mind being in and around water or aqueous solutions, as opposed to hydrophobic substances. So think of phobia is something you're scared of. So these are water fearing substances like oils, right? Things that do not dissolve in the water. So hydrophobic substances like oil molecules typically will have relatively non-polar bonds. Okay? So one kind of rule of thumb in biology and chemistry is that like dissolves like. So polar molecules are more easily dissolved in a polar solution like water, right? Because they are similar, they're both polar. A non-polar substance is going to have a harder time dissolving or mixing with a polar solvent like water. But this is important when we look at cell membranes and their structure and function later on in the semester, because the cell membrane is made up of hydrophobic components related to oils and the phospholipids in the cell membrane. So we'll talk about these more in depth later on, but essentially you have two areas of the cell membrane. You have a hydrophilic head that's going to be exposed to the fluid inside and outside the cell. And then you have a hydrophobic tail. So these are going to be kind of facing inward on one another, insulated and away from the fluid environments. We said water was important because it's going to facilitate a lot of our biochemical reactions in the cell. So most chemical reactions in organisms, in organic chemistry, are going to involve solutes dissolved in water. So again, this is why one of the key clues when we look for life on other planets would be the presence of water, because life as we know it cannot exist without water. So there have been over 800 planets discovered so far outside of our solar system, but only evidence that very few of them have or had water at some point. Within our own solar system, there has been more recent evidence that Mars does have water or did have water at one time. So in the form of some ice caps, and these dark streaks are showing kind of evidence of past water, right? So kind of a river formation where water would be running down these mountains and these channels. So it follows a very similar pattern to what we see from water on Earth. So one of the prevailing theories about Mars is that a long, long time ago it would have been similar to Earth and possibly had life, maybe not as advanced as life on Earth, but would have been similar to Earth. But the reason it no longer has life or looks like Earth anymore is because it is a smaller planet, so it has a smaller core. So a lot of our kind of heat and energy from the planet comes from the molten core of the Earth. So when the core, the smaller core of Mars kind of cooled off earlier, that kind of stopped the life processes on Mars like we still have on Earth. Just something interesting to think about. So when we're looking at solutions in living systems, we have to consider if it's acidic or basic. So that can also affect our biochemical functions in living organisms. So when we talk about something being acidic or basic, we're basically looking at the concentrations of hydrogen atoms or hydroxyl atoms. So in pure water, H2O, right, they are equal. So we have two H's and an O. So we have a single hydrogen and then we have an OH. So everything is balanced, right? So this would be considered a true neutral solution. So as we begin to add different solutes or acids and bases, now we're shifting these concentrations of the hydrogen or the hydroxyls, the OH. So we can use the pH scale to describe if a solution is acidic or basic, right? So if it's acidic, it's on the lower end of the spectrum, right? It has more hydrogen. If it's basic, it's on the farther end of the spectrum and has less hydrogen. The pH scale is measured kind of in a logarithmic scale, Right? So with 7 being true neutral, like pure water, as you go from one pH value to the next, we're just going to add another exponent to this base 10. So when looking at concentration of hydrogen, it's pretty easy because it goes in order of the pH number. So pH 6, right, is going to have 10 to the negative 6 concentration of hydrogen. So then you can say the difference between 6 and 8 on the pH scale, right, would be 10 to negative 2, factor of 2 difference here. So when we talk about an acid, we're just talking about a substance that's going to increase the hydrogen atom concentration in a solution. Right, so the more hydrogen you have, the more acidic that solution will be. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a base has fewer hydrogens and more OH. So the less hydrogen you have, the more basic your solution will be. But it's kind of an inverse relationship in terms of the pH value. So it's kind of intuitive. Most students tend to think, right, the more acidic something is, the higher the pH number. But it's actually the opposite. So lower pH values are more acidic and have greater hydrogen concentrations. Higher pH values are less acidic and have fewer hydrogens. So everything below 7, on the pH scale is considered acidic. So we said pure water was just neutral, so it has an equal amount of hydrogens and hydroxyls. So urine is slightly acidic. We get into things like tomato juice, right, vinegar, lemon juice, battery acid are some of the most acidic substances on this scale. Basic solutions are greater than 7. Right? So things like human blood is slightly basic. It's like 7.3 on the pH scale. Milk of magnesia, ammonia, bleach. Right? These are very basic solutions. Most of our body fluids, so urine, saliva, blood, tears, are in the 6 to 8 range. So pretty close to the center neutral range. So anything kind of outside this range can be potentially dangerous or deadly for a cell or an organism. So because even slight change in our body's pH can be harmful, we have kind of a built-in maintenance mechanism in buffers. So buffers are substances, sometimes proteins, in the blood or the body fluids just to help minimize any changes or dramatic shifts in our body's pH, right? By kind of monitoring and minimizing fluctuations in the concentrations of these hydrogen and OH in our solutions. So depending on which way our pH is trying to shift toward, buffers can either bind and remove hydrogens or they can release hydrogens. Right? Either way is just to maintain our pH. So buffers aren't going to neutralize a solution or make it more acidic or more basic necessarily. They're just going to maintain what it originally was. So if our blood pH, right, is 7.3 and it starts to become more acidic and gets down to say 6, right? So if it becomes more acidic, that means that there are more hydrogens being added to our blood, right? So we don't want any extra hydrogens added to our blood to change our pH. So the buffer will bind those excess hydrogens to keep the pH at that 7.3 range. Vice versa, if we are becoming too basic, our blood's becoming too basic, we're losing hydrogens. So now it's getting up to about 8 on the pH scale. Then we have buffers that can release some hydrogens to make our blood a bit more acidic and bring it back down to that natural 7.3 level. So buffers are going to just maintain pH and prevent any large-scale changes. So it's not only our body fluids that depend on maintaining certain pH levels. Pretty much everything in biology has to exist within certain bounds or ranges, right? Or it can wreak havoc on a system. So acidification of oceans is becoming an increasing problem due to our own human activities in burning fossil fuels. So about 25% of our human-generated CO2 is absorbed by the oceans. So this can form carbonic acid and make the ocean more acidic. So this is one factor that can contribute to coral bleaching. Corals are actually kind of a symbiotic relationship between algae and the coral. So they need certain conditions, specific water quality and environmental conditions to be happy. So once the coral becomes stressed, the algae will leave the coral, right? So the environment becomes too acidic or whatever, the algae are going to die or going to migrate elsewhere. So now the coral is essentially bleached, so it doesn't have those colorful algae anymore, and it becomes more vulnerable. And we know that corals are vast ecosystems for other types of organisms like fish that depend on these habitats. So another consequence of this ocean acidification is a reduction in our marine calcifiers, right? So things that form shells and reef building corals. So as seawater acidifies, right, we're having more CO2 dissolve in the water. So when CO2 binds with water, it forms carbonic acid. Right? And it's going to release some more hydrogen, right? So we increase our concentration of hydrogen, we are decreasing the pH, right? So we're making the water more acidic. So carbonate is something that's present in the ocean water that is required for calcification of marine organisms like our corals, right? Mollusks, or anything that builds a shell, a hard type of shell, calcium shell. So these organisms depend on or having carbonate to build their shells with. But when we have this excess hydrogen in the water, right, it's going to take up some of that carbonate to form bicarbonate. So now the carbonate ions aren't present for these organisms to build their shells with. So lots of kind of widespread ramifications from just these small changes in the pH.